On a recent trip back home, I finally picked up a complete copy of the North American version of Ernest Evans for the Sega Genesis. Why go to the trouble of buying the American version of a Japanese game, you ask? Because in Japan, Ernest Evans was only released on CD. I have absolutely no idea why that decision was made, but the fact is, if you want to play Ernest Evans without loading times, you'll have to get a US copy of the cartridge version. Of course, the Japanese Mega CD version benefits from anime-style cutscenes and CD-quality music, although, to be honest, the guest composer they had write some of the original tracks for the CD version was a historical footnote compared to the magnificence that is Motoi Sakuraba, so the cartridge version has much better music overall. For some reason, they used the boss music from El Viento, which isn't unwelcome. Ernest Evans was developed by Wolf Team, one of the studios that operated within my beloved Nihon Telenet. And hopefully at this point, it doesn't surprise you too much to hear that it plays like crap! Ernest Evans appears to employ multi-jointed ragdolls for the main character and humanoid enemies, which was probably an ambitious thing to do on the Sega Genesis, but at the sacrifice of nearly everything else. Most enemies require 5 to 10 hits to kill, resulting in you standing still for ages swinging your completely untrusty whip again and again. Certain running frames will eat jump inputs, and there's no concept of solid sprites. So if an enemy comes into your hitbox, if it can even be called that, it drains your life meter nearly instantaneously. Thinking that maybe the CD version fixes some of these issues with its oh-so-superior technology? Think again. They play exactly the same. Graphics, controls, instant deaths, it's clearly the exact same code. I've said again and again, Telenet's games often had great presentation with varying quality and gameplay, but how could anyone have thought that this was even remotely acceptable? To be fair, a person can have some fun playing it today if for no other reason than it oozes that Genesis atmosphere. But there's no way in the world they could have brought in a playtester without being told, "Guys, I think there's a big problem here." How could Ernest Evans have gotten a worldwide release while something like Jelly Boy 2 was cancelled? It leaves a gaping hole in my heart for a decent Wolf Team made platformer on the Sega CD. And, as it turns out, there was one, in the form of a little game called Devastator. Devastator is a 2D action shooter, or if we allow a very liberal use of the term, a run and gun, in which you pilot a mech across 7 stages to save the Earth from an alien invasion. Well, they're technically invaders from an alternate dimension, because, of course, this game is much too classy to use something as cliché as aliens. In this case, Devastator refers to the alien race, so this is a game whose title is the name of the bad guys, not the main character. According to the instructions, your mech is called the Vector Versus. Now who's going to start the petition to make him a playable character in the next Smash Brothers? The Vector Versus, God, I hope I don't have to say that name too many more times, has 2 weapons that it always shoots simultaneously. A shorter range hook, which is your standard weapon and will stay with you throughout the game, and a generally longer range sub-weapon which can be changed by picking up weapon items. There are only 3 types of sub-weapon: a spread shot, a laser which is really more like a wave beam, and a sort of crush bomb that sprays downwards. You can power up each weapon by collecting more of the same item, up to a max level 4, and thankfully you can force the items to cycle through the different weapon types by attacking them. Or, if you cycle past the bomber weapon, you can also get a health replenish item in case you're getting low. The only other technique you have is a ground dash, which can also deliver damage to enemies. This is executed by pressing the jump button while ducking, and you can also clear larger distances than usual by jumping while dashing, although, in glorious Telenet fashion, it won't be needed anywhere in the game. While your attack methods are limited, there is some good news about the game design. Devastator contains both action platforming stages and horizontally scrolling shooting stages to keep things from getting too repetitive. Your weapons in the shooting stages are exactly the same as in the action stages, so you'll find yourself rushing in to clobber enemies much more often than shooting them from a distance. but that's actually a kind of fresh take on the genre, assuming you haven't recently spent hours playing Soul Divide. And you can also change the direction you're facing by pressing what used to be the jump button. But again, this will almost never be put into practice, except for bosses. Now that we've talked about the game mechanics, you probably want to know how Devastator plays. And, following the legacy of 16-bit games by a developer known for emphasizing story and cutscenes while rushing through the actual stage design, it's pretty good. Your character moves briskly enough, enemies don't require so many hits to kill that it becomes a chore, hit detection makes sense, and the two different stage types keep it from dragging on. Unsurprisingly, there aren't intricate enemy patterns to learn. You'll just be going balls to the wall and chain hooking the hell out of whatever pops on screen. With one exception, there are these big guys who will charge and shoot at you if you approach them from the front, so you either have to wait for them to turn around or hop behind them to attack. So it's a precursor to Metal Gear Solid. The bosses are a totally different story, however. You'll have to exercise real pattern learning and reflexes to beat them. There's a looseness to it all, which people who have played other games by Wolf Team will understand, but I've come to the point in my gaming career where I don't see it as bad, just different from games that we think of as being very precise like Mario or Castlevania. The graphics and artwork are always competent, but never amazing. You start out fighting in front of a business district in Tokyo with skyscrapers, then move on to inorganic-looking worlds and, of course, outer space. The shooting levels in particular have a respectable amount of parallax, and the last full-length level has a cool fire-in-the-sky effect in the background, although, honestly, I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to be. Most of the enemies are half-robot, half-alien things that wouldn't have been out of place if slapped into nearly any other action game from the late 80s and early 90s. Again, nothing wrong with them, but nothing impressive. I did enjoy some of the boss designs though, in particular the boss of Stage 5, which looks like a turtle that survived a nuclear accident. The one part of Telenet's and particularly Wolf Team's games that usually shined was the music, and thankfully Devastator delivers in this category. Just about every track has a really cool synth rock feel to it, but more importantly, they actually fit with the stages they accompany. The track for the first level has a somewhat casual but hopeful melody which gets you in the mood for an adventure, while the tracks that accompany the Alien World levels are more foreboding, and the first shooting stage in particular provides that essential sense of speed to match the different gameplay. So as haphazard as some of Telenet's games can seem, at least there's consistency between the artwork and sound here. The sound credits show the usual suspects: Motoi Sakuraba, Ryota Furuya, and Shinji Tamura, although I get the impression that not every track was composed by Sakuraba this time. Don't get me wrong, I realize his compositions aren't limited to just one genre, but he definitely had an established style during this period, and some of the songs in Devastator sound quite different. Although there are several that are clearly Sakuraba prog rock, and they're as awesome as you would expect. Really, in some ways, the music is way too good for the game it accompanies. The platforming levels are rather short. The first one in particular is just a minute-and-a-half walk from left to right. The rest are a bit more substantial, at least in length. But if you're expecting fancy platforming techniques like watching your reflection on the ground to cross invisible platforms, you might be disappointed. The shooting levels, however, are pretty much as long as you would expect them to be in a 16-bit game, and they keep you busy the whole time. Other than simplistic level design, my only other complaint with the game is a very slight delay in the control. You won't notice it most of the time, but in some situations where you need to switch back and forth quickly, you'll find yourself still facing the opposite direction of where you want to be. You'll learn to adjust for it, and honestly, in the case of Wolf Team, I've come to expect little quirks like this. Of course, Devastator contains anime cutscenes, which Telenet obviously considered vital to the appeal of their games. Usually, I would just say something along the lines of, it has anime cutscenes and move on, because what I'm really interested in is the gameplay. But in the case of Devastator, they deserve a closer look. While most of the 16-bit CD games with cutscenes are more like anime drawings with a bit of movement in the eyes and mouth, or every once in a while a head turn, Devastator contains fully animated FMV clips between levels. This isn't reminiscent of anime, It's a full-on anime episode. Yeah, the video quality is grainy as hell, but it's a Sega CD. What were you expecting? Compared to a little over 30 minutes of gameplay, the cutscenes add up to a whopping 17 minutes. Even by Telenet standards, this was a big production for one single game. And possibly the best part of it all, the story is just one long series of 80s anime cliches. Everyone keeps talking about this horrible tower that's appeared and is causing all this mayhem, but it never appears on screen once. The heroes are mavericks disobeying orders to save humanity. There's a mysterious group composed of international agents who may or may not be the good guys. Sound familiar? And for some reason, even though the world may be on the brink of destruction, trains are still running. I suppose hardcore anime fans might eat this stuff up, but for me, all I can say is, why? Were companies so desperate to squeeze anime into games at the time that they were willing to just write a bunch of anime tropes on scrap paper, throw them into a basket, pick them out at random, and throw a script together? It adds nothing to the history of anime or the game experience. Okay, it adds one thing. Boobies. Actually, Devastator was based on an OVA that had come out the year before, so it's technically an anime-based video game. And skimming through it reveals that the cutscenes were taken straight from the anime, all mixed up and completely out of context, of course. So, there you have it. The game was intended as a vehicle to promote the anime. In the early days of CD-based video games, many companies, including Telenet, thought that adding in fully voiced anime scenes would improve the experience by giving more context to the game world, so much so that gameplay often took a hit. Devastator is an extreme case in which they tried to force so much story in that it becomes a distraction from what's actually a pretty competent action game. It's a lesson from the past that I wish more game companies would learn from. A game doesn't need to be more than 10% story. Even so, Devastator is almost certainly the best Japan exclusive action game on the Sega CD, so if you're at all interested in retro imports, it's worth your time. To conclude today's episode, I've written a campaign slogan that the director of time travel at Telenet could take back to 1993 with them to help sell the game. Buy Devastator today, because we spent a crapload of money on the anime, and it's better than Ernest Evans.